Alright, one take. Let's see if I've still got it. So I'm RubiconRanger and I'll be your host for today. And today we're going to be talking about damage routing, or quote-unquote Triforcing in Robocraft 2 version 2, or Robocraft 2 revamp, whichever you prefer, which is more similar to the original game. And so there are still techniques and things that are applicable in this version. These things will pretty much always be applicable so long as the damage model remains the same, and even if it changes a little bit just by statistics and like choosing between remaining paths, I think these techniques will always pretty much have some validity. So we're going to quickly cover how damage worked in the old game. A lot of this is going to be rehashed from my old videos a couple years ago. You can go back and watch those. It's going to be a lot more lengthy. This is going to be focused on techniques that are mostly block-based and are relevant to this version of the game. For those of you who haven't watched any of my videos, this will be a crash course of a lot of things. So it's going to be a lot of information to absorb. I apologize. Hopefully it'll be helpful. We'll probably also learn more as the game develops. But one way or another, let's get into it. Okay, so in the old game, damage, there were several different damage types, but at the end of the day, all damage was direct damage. So direct damage, when it strikes a block, usually it strikes and there's a point of origin. If that's a ray cast from a plasma, if it splashes nearby, it'll pick one block. In the current game. In the old game, it would pick several blocks, kind of in a pattern, facing towards the bot from the explosion, and then it would spread out from those. With rail, it would basically fire 3 times in a row instantaneously. But each of those starting points would behave the same way, and that's they would strike the block, and it would check the damage of the incoming shot against the health of the block, and it would subtract the health of the block out from that damage. And then that block would be destroyed if it used up all of the health of the block. And then it would move on to all adjacent connected blocks. And each step has to basically be destroyed before it can move on to the next step. So in this case, if damage struck the center here and it started moving on to gray, all the gray blocks would have to be consumed before damage moved on to blue in this case. And you can sort of see this with the paint gun, even in this version, which is kind of nice. So let's talk about partial damage. So if there's not enough damage to consume all the blocks on a step, and this is how it worked in the old game. I don't know if the mechanics are exactly the same in the new game, but it doesn't invalidate any of these techniques necessarily. So all blocks on a step have to be destroyed, but if there's not enough damage to destroy all the blocks, it basically checks its health. It picks one block randomly, and it does the same thing. It checks its health against the damage against the health of the block. And then if that block's health is used up, it's destroyed, and then it'll randomly pick another block and another block and another block until there's not enough damage to destroy the remaining block, and then usually it takes out that portion of the block's health, and that block remains on the bot with that remaining portion of health. So there's another way you can lose health, and that is by having parts disconnected from the whole of your body. So if your body is separated in 2 halves, in the old game, the half with more CPU, or like if you see in the upper left corner, the points that you spend on parts, the part of your bot with the higher part cost would stay behind. That's regardless of health or anything else. In the new version, we have the pilot seat, which is a whole new thing to consider when we're building. And if something becomes disconnected from the pilot seat, the same thing happens. You lose the part that is not attached to the pilot seat. Now, in the old game, there was a kind of a caveat to that, in that you would always, damage would flow out first from where the shot struck, and then it would check to see if parts were disconnected. So in this case, if I only have a single tank track here, I don't know why you would, but let's just say that's the case, and damage comes up this line, right? It's propagating out and spreading up this line, and it reaches this red block. Before it can move on to the end, let's say that's just our blue block, it's going to do the same process where it's going to pick between this part and this block. But when this block becomes removed, if it were to stop here, this tank track would become disconnected after it checks the damage calculation's done and it stops, right? And then it removes the block, and then it checks to see if there are parts disconnected. I don't know how that works in the current version. We'll have to test it later. It's a fairly big deal because it doesn't check along every step along the way. If it did, then you wouldn't be able to use what we would call single point damage sinks back in the day. So you could have like an electroplate with a single connection point here, and if damage were to, in order for damage to reach this blue block, it has to consume blocks on the next step, which would include this part that only has one attachment point. So this health pool would be gating this blue block. And that works for multi-connection components too, obviously. So if there's two parts, it's the same rule, right? It's got to flow through here and into this cube before it can go past this next orange cube. So that's, yeah, single point damage sinks and whatnot. So we talked about direct damage and all that good stuff. What if you have a part with multiple connection points? Well, in the old game, every part was treated as one step. So if you had like an arrow rod or a module with 6 connection points that were fairly spread out, so in this case it's spread out in that the tank tracks are connected further away than just one step, right? So it does not, in the old game at least, take more time to cross a bigger part, right? It's still one step, and the health of this part has to be used up before the next step can occur. Now, I would show you with the paint gun, but they've made it so that when it colors things, it does count this tank track as 2 steps, but we're pretty sure it's 1 because your tank tracks pretty much always stay connected to your bot, and they act as one common health pool until they're totally removed. It'd be silly if damage were to flow through from one connection point and out the other end before using up the health of the tracks, because then that would break all the connection points on the tracks and they'd pop off. But, you know, haven't tested it. Maybe that is the case. But let's pretend it's the old game. So if I hit this with the paint gun, you're going to see that damage jumps, if it will actually be black. It actually jumps across the connection here, and it acts as 1 step, or in this case 2 steps. It'd show up 1 block earlier. This would be blue if it were the old game, but it's counting this as 1, 2, 3. So regardless of shape or size, damage jumps across blocks. That's not very relevant to this version of the game, unfortunately, because there aren't that many components with multiple connection points. Pretty much everything is a single connection point component. So that's kind of a brief overview of all the damage types in the old game and how things behaved in the old game. And that also kind of covers the new game, because all the weapons in the new game just do direct damage. Your rail fires a single shot instead of 3 instantaneous shots, and where it strikes, it just hits and spreads out from there. It's just a big chunk of damage. Same thing with plasma. I think it picks the nearest point, but someone will have to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, if you know better. And it'll spread out from that point, right? It picks a block that it's quote-unquote hit, either by directly hitting it or selecting the closest block from where it splashes, if it's within range, and it spreads out like we talked about here. So that's that. Now, what can we do to make our bots better? Well, there's a couple different things you want to do. You want to generally try and preserve your movement parts and your guns as long as possible. So we call those functional parts. You want to try and keep them around as long as possible because they make you effective in combat. And this game also has the pilot seat, which if you lose it, you die, so that's pretty important. And all the parts other than the tank tracks are single connection point parts. They also have pretty large hit boxes, and at least some of them do, and they're pretty easy to shoot off in this game, and pretty much everything other than tank tracks has fairly low health. So unfortunately some of these techniques might be overkill, because the parts are so weak that once they become uncovered they get stripped off anyway. So rule number 1 rule of thumb is basically cover up your components as best you can. You know, you can put blocks in front of guns. That does kind of reduce the angle at which you can fire, because you can't actually fire through blocks in this game. But cover up your movement parts, cover up your tank tracks, cover up your wheels as best you can. Wings are a little too in a bad place right now that it can't carry a lot of mass, so you can't really cover those things. But hovers you can embed. All that's subject to change though as the game's developed. But okay, enough of that. let's talk about stuff that worked in the old game and is most certainly relevant in the new game. We're going to go over dual mounting, we're going to talk about weaves, we're going to talk about kind of a combination. You can think of it as dual mounting, but it's really just kind of like spaghetti forcing here, and how you can network a bot together. In the old game we'd have multiple connection components, but in this game we're just got blocks, so we're just going to use blocks. And we'll talk about layering things and so on and so forth. Okay, moving on. We've got this fancy gun here, and some people would call this a remote connection. So it's really connected down to this block here, and you can imagine there's armor out in front here. But if you're shooting from the top or the front of the bot, your damage, as long as it's not hitting the gun directly, is going to have to flow down to that connection point, and once that's destroyed, you lose the gun. Old versions of the game, the most, you hear people talk about Triforcing, and really what they meant was, just like have a cube and slope away from it on all sides and have it connect either, back and down, or, just have it connect down like this. Unfortunately, that's not very good, because damage coming in the front here can still flow, in 3 blocks or so, 1, 2, 3, and then you lose your gun mount. Or if the case, or one more if you have a connection behind it. And then you'll lose your gun mount, and then you'll lose your gun. So it's really not that far for the damage to flow. But this remote connection isn't very good either, because if we leave it up, what's going to happen is damage might occur down here. Let's say you've got a big flat land ship, and someone manages to slam dunk a plasma between your wheels and it hits the ground, transfers up to the underside of your bot, and oh no, you've lost your gun now. So unfortunately that goes for any block along this chain. If it's hit, you're going to lose your gun ahead of time, and ideally we want to keep the gun as long as possible. So what if I told you you could still do this, but for just the cost of a couple more blocks connected to one more place, you get pretty much all the benefits and none of the downsides here. All you have to do in this case is, and we're gonna actually, let's yeah, this works. We'll just grab another cube here, and we'll color this line white. The connection block is black. Why not? And we'll connect it right here. And then the other connection point in gray will be here to the body. And then we'll route away from it here. And of course, when you're covering up the other side of this, you got to force away here from any connection points. You don't want to connect to these. They're only meant to connect at the ends and at the junction here with the gun. So what's going on here? This is a classic dual mount. I didn't come up with this. I don't know who originally came up with this. Catafrat's the one who originally told me about it. He's an old builder who kind of standardized some of this stuff, and we kind of started up a clan, or a lot of Emity's Podium, the clan kind of formed techniques around the base that he started off on. So anyway, if you're listening, Catafrat, it was good stuff. We're still enjoying it. So what's happening here? We've got 2 lines attaching the gun to 2 different places in the body, and damage still has to flow around and go into those before it reaches the gun. But now, if, say, damage strikes down here and it destroys this bottom mounting point, and then it stops, right, some distance up, well, now you're not going to lose your gun anymore, because you've got a connection to another point in the body. But it's still protected, and I'll show you why. So if damage were to flow up this line, say it hits as close as it possibly can, right? If the line's still covered up and damage is coming in from the front, say you've got more armor this way, but let's just say this is cut flat, and damage strikes right here at the entrance. Well, now it's going to have to spread out in 3 dimensions as it flows up this line, right? So it's flowing out to all the connecting blocks on the next step here, and then on the next step it goes to even more. And by the time we're at the 3rd block here, that's too many, it's quite far. It's consuming a large portion of the bot, right? 1, 2, 3, right? 1, 2, 3. And then it has to go 4 to the gun. So you're using up more and more blocks, not quite exponentially, but you're using up more blocks on the body side in order to climb up that line. So this is great for handling large bursts of damage. Unfortunately, it's not as effective at fighting against chip damage. If someone were to cut a little hole into your bot, it tends to break these lines fairly quickly, but it's going to be just as effective as just doing that single block and sloping away from it on the sides. In fact, it's going to be way more effective, specifically against rail and plasma that do large bursts of damage, right? So if damage is landing here, let's pick black. You can see how much of the body has to be consumed before damage reaches my gun. And that's assuming that it even lands close to the entrance. If it lands up here, it has to float all the way down and around and then back up the line and into the gun. So we're almost using up the whole chunk of armor here just to get to the gun, right? There's other hidden benefits as well. If damage strikes this line in the middle, you may lose your gun, but it's forcing the health of that gun to be consumed before it flows through and out of the line and into the other parts of your robot. So if you have a high health component that you kind of like want to effectively use the health of, if a high damage strikes this line, it will almost always consume the health of that part before it flows out. Now, of course, if you get struck right in the middle, right, or like here, and it flows mostly out to the body as well, and then, you know, just also happens to barely catch this block, that's worst case scenario. But you want to try and limit that by not using these too much, or don't put too many of them down, or don't make them thick. Or don't, yeah, so like for instance, so why not make this 10 miles long? You know, it goes to way far away. Well, unfortunately, the more blocks you use for each mounting point, the more of your body percentage-wise is going to be dedicated to these dual mount lines. And as that increases, the likelihood that incoming damage is going to break your part off earlier increases, right? You want to try to spend as much CPU on effective armor as possible, stuff that's meant to take damage. And because of the nature of these mounts, where it basically has to flow out, you know, sort of exponentially on the body side as it climbs up the mount, you don't need to put down very many of these, right? Like 3 or 4 is enough to soak damage from most things. And if you're really picky, you can calculate out, you know, like say you've got, this is the front of your bot, you can do math on how much damage does a rail at your tier do with maximum boost, because we kind of sort of have damage boost. And how many blocks does it take? How many blocks does it take before that damage is used up, right? And you can like count on the body side, like color your bot, and then, you know, make sure that there's enough health in that area with like 20% margin, so that you know that your line's going to be effective, if you really want to get that crazy about it. But usually, rule of thumb is 3 or 4 is max what you should do. So same thing for having more than 2 lines, right? 2 lines is ideal. It is the best, or at least from my experience and the experience of others, you're getting the most benefit per CPU spent here as possible without, you know, making this likely to be hit, right? If you add a 3rd line here to your gun and you connect it to some other place, yeah, that's extra insurance that it's staying around, but it's also now more likely to get hit on this line. So there's a cost benefit that you have to do there every time that you set one of these up. Now, there might be cases for extremely vital parts where that is legitimate to do. For instance, gosh golly, we've got pilot seats now. If we lose this, you lose your whole body. You're done. So you want to make sure that sticks around for a long time. So if you armor up well around your pilot seat, this is one of those rare cases where 2 lines may not be enough, right? So it's no big deal if you lose a gun. Like, this is pretty much overkill in this version of the game for holding up a part that only takes 2 shots of laser damage, right? This gun's not going to hang around for very long, whereas like it takes 2 blocks. Like 1 laser shot shoots 2 blocks out versus 2 shots takes a gun's off. It's going to get stripped super quick. Same thing with your functional components. They're huge, so they get taken off. Your pilot seat, however, is fairly small and compact, and you can pretty much cover it up. It's just these 3 blocks and an L. So this is one of the few cases where a triple mount might be deserved because it's such an important component. And there are arguably better ways to protect your pilot seat, and we'll talk about those in a little while here. But a cheap way to do it would be to triple mount it, right? So if damage is coming in, pretty much damage can strike anywhere in this structure, right? So like if damage were to strike here, it'll take out these first two mounts, and it can use about that much damage, or take out that many blocks, and your seat would still survive. And if it take damage from the front, your seat, as long as it doesn't climb up far enough to hit the seat block, would also survive. Same thing with this corner, right? So you pretty much have to lose all three of these connection points in order to lose your seat. And these three lines will hold it up, connected to three different places in the body. So, moving on from dual mounts. These are, by the way, these are probably the best return on invested time and CPU that you can possibly use. Right, just doing this for every single one of your components, super easy to do. Make sure you spread your mount points out so you're not losing huge clusters of them at once. And this will be a very effective use of your time. And it's probably about the best routing you can get. It might even be too much. It might be way overkill for this game in its current state, unless you're fighting a lot of rails and plasma, and then it is legitimate. So let's take this and combine it with the damage sync kind of concept I was talking about earlier. So let me grab these tank tracks because I'm a poor man and this is a low CPU bay. We're going to put them over here, and we're going to take our pilot seat and we're going to put it right here. So what's going on here? What did I just do? So say you want a fancy backup machine here, like this is going to be your little backup tank track bot, and I've seen someone do this and it made me think about how I might improve that with some good old routing tricks. So now what we've got here, so it's connected to the body in two different places. There's basically two separate lines here. There's blue that comes in and it wraps, goes into the pilot seat on the side, and then it comes out on the other side here and it climbs and it goes up to the body here. So we're basically attaching to the body here, 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 and here in front of the pilot seat. The other one wraps up from the bottom and does the same thing, kind of in the opposite direction. So let's put those tank tracks back. But there's something extra fun going on here in that in order for damage to reach the seat, these front two connections here, if damage is climbing in through this connection, and you can pretty much have it go to body here, right? Like this is the end of the mount. You can have it just be blocks here. Maybe you want to force away from your other seat connection here, right? So that it's got 2 points that have some quote-unquote damage distance between them, so you're less likely to lose more points of contact with the body. But if damage comes in here, in order to reach this junction, so we don't want to lose this junction because it's also holding up the seat through to this part of the body, but this tank track is now gating our input. So it's a single point damage thing, well, multiple point in this case. So now damage has to flow in, and then it flows to this block, if I can actually hit it with the paint gun. Here, here, and then here on the next step, and here, if I can hit it. Nope, not that one. This one. Okay, it doesn't want to paint. So here, so on this step it's going here and here. And then on the next step, assuming, I'm adding one more block for extra leniency in case it is another damage step to start using up the health of the other track or whatever, right? So 2 blocks guaranteed damage is going to go over this tank track. So it's got to use up both of these tank tracks coming from either side, right? From here, 1, 2, and then from the same point, 1, 2, before it reaches this junction. So our junction's protected by this tank track. And if you have another set of tank tracks on the other side, you're like, oh no, well, what happens if the tank tracks get shot? Well, that's why you have another set of tank tracks on the other side. So damage flowing out from this tank track will go 1, 2 directly into this tank track. And then it's the same scenario, right? It's another 2 to get to that junction. And the health of the other tank track has to get used up now. So, very nice. And you might say, oh, well, that breaks both your connections to the body here. That's why I've got a second set of connections going up to a higher place in the body. So these gray points are protected by the tank tracks, and then they're still held up to the body through these other 2 lines. So, pretty cool. Okay, and we'll kind of explore a whole system of how you might do this with blocks later. I would talk about split protection next, because that would be the next thing in the agenda, but it's not as relevant in this version of the game. So split protection, I'll just quickly go over the concept. If you were to have a very long body, or a wide body, or anything that isn't a perfect sphere, having your bot divided in half is really bad. You want to avoid that. So it's basically an independent connection from one end of your bot to the other end of your bot, usually with arrow rods, which would, if you wrapped the middle of them with blocks, if they got shot out, there'd only one hitbox in a place at a time. The rod would stay behind, and it's basically like two magic floating connections. And the wrapped portion of the rod, you could just shoot straight through it. So you could have a split protection set that would hold up your weird hot dog bot together from end to end. And then you could basically dual mount either end of the split protection set, and it would ensure that the end stayed connected even if the front started getting damaged, and held it up as long as possible until it was no longer there, or like all your dual mount connections go away on your multiple split protection sets, at which point you no longer have that end of the bot and it doesn't matter anymore. But we're skipping that here, because in this version, if you get cored out, you're pretty much dead. Your pilot seat is in the middle of your bot. The easiest way to split a bot on the old version of the game was shoot the middle of it. Usually you put pilot seats in the middle of your bot. So it's still sort of relevant, but we don't have wrapped rods, so it's hard to like cheese it, you know. And two, your pilot seat tends to be in the middle if you don't want to insta-die getting shot in the wrong spot. And once you get cored out, you tend to die. So we're going to jump right from talking about this model and what you can do with single point sinks and dual mounts, or whatever you want to call them, here, and we're going to jump over to weaves, which is just basically using blocks to manage the flow of damage and control where it goes in a sort of, you get to encode how you want the damage to behave. It's kind of fun. We're going to go over some really popular designs here, and then I'm going to hopefully expand your brain and tell you that you can do whatever you want. Okay, so this is slope weave. You notice if I go over here, it's just a bunch of slopes. And the rule is, for every step in, so damage in this case flows side to side faster than it does front to back. And specifically, it's set up in such a way that damage from this corner is as isolated as it possibly can be from the opposite corner, but not the other way around. So damage flowing this way flows more quickly. It's taking damage, it's basically trying to spread out damage from the top corner here side to side. And you can count how damage is going to behave when it's flowing in, right? So if you're taking like a mathematical view of it, damage striking this block, if it wants to flow into the body, it has to go 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, versus on the body side, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, if there was another block over here, it would flow out to here, right? So we have let me just add another block for illustration here. So we basically have a 2-to-1 ratio of speed of damage, right? So 4 blocks horizontally versus towards the back of the bot. That'd be one more here. So yeah, it's like kind of sort of 2-to-1 basically. So to get 2 blocks, you're having to consume 4 the other direction, and that rule holds up for damage both flowing down and back. It spreads it. It prefers to spread it side to side. So if we hit this with the paint gun, you can see this block will be the last block to get colored in pretty much. Kind of fun. This was super popular. You got to be really careful when you're using it, because there's no easy thing here, right? Everything is upsides and downsides. So yeah, this is cool if you manage to keep somebody in front of you. Say you make your whole bot out of this and you get hit from the side. Well, unfortunately, damage is going to just rip from side to side on your bot because it flows directly from side to side, right? It's not going to share damage to the front and back as fast, and you're going to have a bigger pit as a result of that damage striking your bot. It's going to cut into you much faster. So you do not want to get hit from the side. Or if you do have something vital in here, you're going to want to force away from that side. And you can kind of sort of see here, I've got, it's Let's see if I can move this up. I think I have some colored blocks here, just demonstrating that which way damage flows. So the blue blocks, the blue block and the red block are the same kind of grid space away from this white one. So it's basically 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, but you're going to see it takes quite a bit longer for the damage to reach the red block as the blue block. So it's pretty much going to take twice as long, right, before it reaches red versus blue. And then, like I said, it goes both in and it resists from this corner on, basically. I won't say much more than that. Here's another one where we basically kind of have diamond shapes all stacked up, and if you wanted to continue this pattern, you'd go like this, and so on, like that. This is called Hobbs Weave, after one of my old clan members. I call it that. I'm sure somebody might have come up with it before him. He claims it was his idea. I'll just take him at his word, whatever. And this is kind of interesting. Unlike Slope Weave, where it has a kind of diagonal resistance, this one's omnidirectional, at least from the sides. So it resists damage from the front and the back and the top and the bottom, all at equal speed relative to damage going side to side. So just the same as the other one. Damage flowing to reach, if it'll actually be the color I want. You'll see it reaches that blue block much more quickly than it reaches the red block on the left here, even though it's the same number of steps away in the grid space, right? So it's having to flow 1, 2, 3, 4 to reach red, and only 1, 2 to reach blue. And same thing for, I think I had another example. I don't remember which angle I was coming from though, but same thing here. So resists from top and side, and basically same kind of ratio. And then we've got a real fun one. This was known as Tetraweave, and it's basically sheets of kind of diagonal strings of tetras, like so. And you would, the way you put it together is you basically start a bunch of these lines going up with them connected on the edges. You start the same pattern in each row. You start from the same place in each row, and then the next row you have going the next plane, you start going the opposite direction, but connected to the faces, and you keep connecting on the edges. So like this, and this, and this, and this, and that's how you make Tetraweave. Tetraweave is kind of fun. Doing the math on this one's a little bit weird, but just know that it has generally omnidirectional damage resistance. And you're like, okay, well, why is that helpful? Why does that help me at all? Because, you know, if it's all made out of this, I mean, technically, I think there's some directions where damage does flow faster. It's going to flow faster along this way, I think, if I can actually get the color I want. Yeah, so it's going to go in one kind of diagonal slightly faster. But if you pop a bunch of this into the core of a body with a uniform outside shell, damage is going to take a long time to flow through the middle versus sharing to the outside shell, right? So if you imagine this were a cube, there was a cube of this in the middle, and then this black here was a shell surrounding it, and damage came in from this direction and it struck the shell, you're going to find that it takes damage almost as long to flow through the center here as it does to wrap all the way around the outside. It's kind of cool. You can see it here. You're seeing that damage will arrive through the center and around the outside at about the same time. So it's like omnidirectional resistance. That's kind of a fun one. And these are all known by old players. I'm sure everyone will recognize these. But let's talk about doing whatever you want, which is this final model. Basically, you can take these concepts, you can program how you want your damage to flow any way you want if you think long enough about it. So here I've got an example that's sort of like this slope weave, but I've stretched it out a little bit more side to side. And that's required me to isolate more blocks from one another. You can kind of think of it as just kind of a matrix of these full cubes. I did these full cubes because it's easier to picture in your head. I could do slopes facing this way, or with the two sides up here, but it's easier to see this way. And this is kind of like the slope weave, but now it's an even greater ratio. So In order to flow one block back, we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, versus side to side. So it's basically a more extreme version of the previous one, right? So it's got a larger ratio. And the way it's set up is it's just staggering these connection points. You can kind of see this stretched out grid that's just been shifted up and back one. So in order for it to flow down and in, it has to go 2 more blocks, right, than the previous pattern. So I'm adding 2 more blocks of length side to side. And it's going to behave the exact same way as the other one, it's just more extreme. So you'll see here, there's extreme side-to-side spread before it spreads back. And of course, once again, it's corner to corner. So if I hit this corner, the last thing to stand will be that corner over there. And you can take that in 3 dimensions, and you can encode your own weave however you want. At some point, it becomes kind of like a noodle spam structure. Make sure it doesn't get too disconnected. You don't want large chunks falling off. And that's a good time to talk about onion shelling, or just regular weave. So there's flat weave, where you just take a bunch of triangles and you put them together kind of like this. You'll see I've got connection points, but if you wanted to continue this pattern without connecting, it would just be like that. You can have layers totally isolated from one another in big flat sheets, like a blade of armor. What a fun concept. Unfortunately, if you set up your big blade of sheets and you only connect them along the edge and someone shoots out this edge, you tend to lose the whole sheet. And if you have it connected, it's better if you have it connected at top and bottom. But once again, everything is a trade-off. There is no 100% win, right? You try to build a strength into your bot and then you play around that strength, but you've got to be aware that there's weaknesses. And something that I always say is, if you restrict damage flow into an area, you're also restricting damage flow out of, or from being shared out of, that very same area. So if you have a block of meat here in the middle of your bot, like if this setup were strapped into the middle of your bot and you didn't have any of this routing around it, and someone happens to poke, and you've got an onion shell setup where there's many of these ablative layers around your bot, around your seat, and someone manages to poke a hole through there and toss a single plasma in, well, unfortunately, damage isn't going to be able to share with that layer next to it, or like 1 or 2 blocks out, because it's disconnected, right? Because there's no layer sharing, once it gets in there and it starts to spread, if there's not enough blocks to soak it up and it's a very small volume, it's going to pop and you're going to die. This was way worse in the old game because we had stuff like rail that would shoot 3 times in a row and leave huge holes in your bot. But it's especially important now with the pilot seat. Be very wary of setting these layers up. One way you can alleviate that is kind of, I guess it's still taking this concept and just spreading it out to the sheets. You can come up with a pattern of connections that have regular share points between the layers, so that A, they don't get disconnected, and B, they still have very good isolation from one another, right? So you resist damage flow in quite severely, right, towards the central point, but then you're not going to get hit in a spot and not have it share with at least 1 more layer of blocks to help soak up that damage. So in this case, we're connecting, so there's 3 layers here, 1, 2, 3. The first layer I'm connecting on blue. You'll notice red here is not connected. Same thing with the other side. And the bottom, right? We're connecting blue back 1, and then it has to go all the way over diagonally, essentially. So like 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks to reach this red connection on the second layer. So it comes up from the bottom here, this block, and it has to flow all the way over to this red. And then it goes into the final layer on red, and then it would flow out from there. So the final point, I guess, would be this black block. So if we grab that color and we start from red, maybe I'll grab white actually, and you'll see that the last block to take damage is that black block. So that would be your safest block. Unfortunately, it would be your most isolated block. So if your seat was like up here and this layer gets hit like right here, sayonara, you know. So that's why you don't want to do that. And to extend this pattern, if you're having trouble seeing how that would continue, my next red connection would be here, next blue connections would be here, you know, just go back a layer here, this would connect here, and that would continue, right? So you get kind of this offset checkerboard pattern. Right? So it would be another red block here, right? So it would just continue in all 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions, I guess. So a fair warning here, you're gonna be really careful if you're mixing these styles of routing. So your kind of encoded metamaterial here, where you get to figure out, you get to shape how the damage flows. If you combine that with this, it's not as effective, because instead of damage flowing out and spreading kind of exponentially in every step, it's restricted in the rate of flow in one direction. So if you were to take this same dual mount and attach it to this, the rate of absorption on the body side is going to be much lower than if you were to just have block spam. So the most effective way to use these lines here is to mount them to pure block spam. You want the damage to get soaked up as fast as possible in order for these to be effective. This is still, you can still connect to this and it'll be good. You just got to be really careful when you're counting your damage, because it's going to take much more length to make these worth it, or to have a very safe connection. So just be aware of that. Okay, I think I've pretty much covered everything that's in this little playground room here. So you're like, oh, Rubicon, this is a lot of waffling on about a bunch of stuff. What does this even look like when it's practically implemented? Okay, I'll show you. So let's go and exit this bay, and we'll go into this practical demonstration bay. Oh, would you look at that? What the hell am I looking at? Well, I'll tell you, it's some really, depending on who you are, kind of complicated stuff, but not really that complicated. This is kind of like a network of just connections between parts where everything is counted out to make sure damage enters and exits the system properly, right? So we've basically got, if we look from underneath, we've got our wheel mounting block, and I'll hit this with a paint gun so you can see what's going on, kind of. So what's happening here is we've got a mounting block, which is our black block, and that's isolated from this rail on top of it. So in order for damage to reach that rail connection point here, it has to go all the way through here. And then we've got a short connection through to the body. And you're like, okay, what does that all mean? So this, we call this a sync side connection. So in this case, I have a shorter sacrificial connection to the body from my movement part. And you're like, why is that? Well, you want to make sure that these parts, one, they're isolated from one another, and two, if they're connected to some other part of the system. So in this case, I've got this long single strand of blocks running along the length of my body. So I'm kind of trying to do the split protection thing, but not really. It's totally different. But I want to make sure, this doesn't do me very much good. Ideally, it holds up the front and the back of my bot together if the middle gets shot out. But that doesn't do me very much good if the damage flows up this line and breaks the connection running from front to back. So we need to take our giant hitbox parts and make sure that if damage strikes them directly, it's going to be at least shared with the body somewhat, right? So we've got a line that's 3 long going to the body from this wheel. So if damage hits this wheel in 3 kind of ticks, it'll flow out to the body, and it'll start flowing out freely into block spam and hopefully soak up damage before it climbs up this line. And the line here is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. So it'll get to flow another additional 2 out of here. And if you think that's too short, or if you think it's too long and you want it to share damage with the body even faster, you can put 2 blocks down. This 3 is overkill, right? You still want to make sure to isolate this wheel from the body here, which is why I've got it on 3. Personal preference. Probably could get away with 2 like this. So each of the wheels has a sync side connection, and then there's a slightly longer connection to the top rail. And you're like, okay, so what now? Well, we've got a connection that goes to the rail, and then we've also got, the rails run front to back. So you can think of this white rail as connecting these 3 wheels to one another. Now you're like, oh no, what if damage strikes this rail? Okay, so we've got sinks on the rail too. So these are 2 away from the body, but damage flowing out from any point on this rod, so to the body, if you strike right here on the entrance to the wheel, it's going to have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then at 5 it starts spreading freely to the body. And then that's, I think, the length of 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 5 to the wheel mount. But if damage lands, so that's not super great, but keep in mind that's going to use up, it's going to flow both ends, both ways in the rail here as well. It's going to use up the health of these blocks as well. But if damage strikes between them, what you really don't want to happen, and why I have these sinks in the middle of these lines, is you really don't want this line to get hit in the middle and then only have spaghetti leading to each wheel, because that damage is going to climb down and pop 2 wheels at once. So this is insurance. This is isolating the 2 wheels from one another, right? So damage striking here is going to flow to the body on 2 ticks and spread really rapidly. And to reach the wheel, it has to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whereas on this side, it's going to go 1, 2, and then it goes, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2 more, basically. I don't have enough blocks because I'm poor, but you get the idea. It takes a huge chunk of damage starting from the middle of this line here to reach both wheels. Same idea for wheel to wheel, right? Damage flowing all the way around from one wheel to another is taking a huge path. That's like 14 plus blocks. There's no way damage is going to go from wheel to wheel along this backbone, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so there's other things going on. I've got connections, so that I'm sinking out of the rail at the ends here. So it is connected to the body. And then I've also got something else going on here with the blue blocks. And what I'm kind of doing is I'm using these blue blocks to connect from side to side. And you're going to notice that they're not connected directly to the wheels themselves. Well, they are sometimes, but I'm offsetting them by 1 connection if I can. And the reason for that is because ideally you want the system to stay interconnected as best you can. So I'm using the wheels as like a 50-50 gamble sync in this case to help isolate this chain. And you're like, okay, well, that's a lot of garble. I'll tell you what I mean. So if damage flows up this line and it flows into this black block, my blue chain is connected here. And it still could offer me, if this white block were to survive, a connection from this rail, this white rail, to the other rail and the other functional part. So there is, assuming the old damage model is the current model, which it might not be, but if you remember, when damage flows out of a block on the next step, it does a 50-50 in this case because there's 2 blocks, but it'll randomly pick a block on the next step. If it picks the wheel, it'll have to use up the health of the wheel before it moves on to this white block. So this is helping just give you a small chance that your line will remain intact. And I did the same thing with the pilot seat here even. The wheels gate the pilot seat, or at least gamble force gate the pilot seat, I guess. So damage flowing up here, my pilot seat is mounted here. So if it's flowing up through the middle here, and my pilot seat's kind of mounted weirdly here, it like comes up to the back and it like attaches in the middle of this blue line, which by the way I have sinks on some of the blue lines attached to the body in the middle of their lines. Okay, maybe not these 2. And one of the other designs I attached in the middle of those as well, to kind of have them sync out as well, for the same reason that I have attachments in the middle of the white line. So damage flowing up through here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the pilot seat, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the wheel. So it's just like a little extra insurance. Having damage flow all the way into your bot and up into your seat in one shot is going to be pretty rare, because you're going to have blocks all around these parts that are not connected to them, and those will be soaking up damage. So it's pretty unlikely that's going to happen, but it's just a little extra insurance. Maybe plasma gets popped right here. You don't want it to flow through here before taking a wheel out. You'd rather lose a wheel than die instantly. So, all right, we talked about that, and we talked about the side-to-side connections, and I think that's about it. Yeah, there's 2 rails front to back, so you can kind of think of it like a grid. So this would be like a grid here, with connection side to side between the wheels, and then lengthwise along the edges. So it's kind of like a little box, right? And you can shoot out nodes and it will still, parts of it will still remain connected. But they're all isolated from one another still in the body as well. So you can shoot out any one of these wheels and you're not going to lose another wheel. You're not going to lose the pilot seat, hopefully. That rule kind of changes once you've had a lot of your outside armor stripped off and there's nothing to quote-unquote sink anymore. But there's enough isolation, once again, that in order for damage to flow from part to part, it's going to more effectively use up the healthier parts anyway. So there you go. There's an example. And let's go and look at one more thing. So I do have a few bots that are actually put together and use this stuff. I believe my hover is implementing the same thing. And I think I did the same thing. I think I basically have two backbones in this that run the length of the body. And then I've done things like connect my gun into it. So for instance, the gun here, my rail is mounted. I've got the two kind of like backbones that split off and connect to hovers. And this one connects on 4 to the backbone line itself, or the rail, whatever you want to call it. And then it connects on 2 to the body in the back, which is like a safe direction. So yeah, that's the other thing you got to think about here is if you're making sync connections or safe connections that are really long, you got to think about where damage is going to come from. When stuff gets taken off, think about the order that it's going to come off in and try to limit the volume of your really important lines and their exposure versus the armor around them, right? So in this case, I've got a short connection. If I ran that short connection to the front and I got damaged in the front, it's going to be more likely to break the gun early. So I've got a sync connection going out the back. So if the gun's shot directly, it sinks and it dumps into the armor in the back. But I'm less likely to get shot in the back here and lose the gun mount early. So I think that's about everything. I could quickly go over a guide from Cataphat that he wrote back in the day. There's an old PDF, but I think I'll do that in another video. For now, that'll be it until we learn more, or I learn more, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot to learn. The information in this video may be out of date very quickly, so be sure to check the posted date of the video versus the latest patch notes, and feel free to comment if you know something that I don't, because I probably don't know it. There's a lot that I don't know. This is just a rehash of old stuff and how it can apply to the new game. Alright, I think that was one take. I think I've still sort of kind of got it. Everybody have a good night.